Good afternoon. It's John Joseph here at Man Road United Church, getting ready for our wonderful speaker. And I will say over to Susan Johnson.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're happy to welcome Vernon today, who will talk to us about sponsoring a refugee family from Syria, his experience with that. Something that's very, there's always been a need, to find homes for refugees, and now more than ever with what's happening in the world. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Susan. And thank you, John Joseph, JJ, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here sharing the stage with you.
1 second, let me just do that. Okay.
JJ and I and numerous members of the congregation at Metropolitan United Church were part of our refugee sponsorship committee, which was formed in 2015, to help in a small way to address the needs of a growing number of Syrian refugees forced out of their country by that seemingly never-ending civil war in Syria. Our first sponsorship involved a wonderful Muslim family of 7, mother, father, and 5 children under the age of 11. Once our sponsorship year had come to an end and this first family had become somewhat self-sufficient and independent, we took on, under the same program, a Christian Iraqi family of 4, mother, father, and 2 young children. And they seem to have become completely independent and self-supporting. My comments today are going to be based not only on my involvement with these 2 families, but also on some of the experiences that I've heard of from other refugee sponsorship groups. These are ones who have shared some of their experiences with me. I'm sure you will understand that to avoid improper disclosure and confidential personal information being circulated, I will have to modify or limit certain of the details. I don't consider myself to be an expert on this subject by any means, but I look forward to this conversation. This is not intended to be a lecture. The subject of refugee sponsorship generally would be a multi-day program at a very, very minimum. What I was envisaging, and I hope we'll have enough people present to do it, is sort of a discussion involving myself and JJ, enhanced by your questions, comments, concerns. And rather than saving them to the end, which you can certainly do if you'd like to, I think it would be helpful, and I invite you to raise any questions that you have along the way, because that could usefully shape the direction of this conversation.
So to that point, question I might ask, so why did you feel called to be part of the refugee committee? Where was that initial tap on the shoulder that said yes?
Well, essentially what it was, how could you not jump in and do that when you look at all the comforts that we have provided to us by Canadian society and by the government of Canada, and having lived as I have in this country, in this city, my entire life, I have just been so blessed, and it just felt like a natural thing to do when that initial group at Met called a meeting to see if we had enough strength to get on with it. And I guess it's become increasingly apparent as more and more countries have generated refugees. And certainly I intend to jump in when Metropolitan United next gets involved. But I will get to some of the issues that we are facing and other refugee sponsors will be facing. I'm sure that you're mostly aware of the fact there are 3 different types of refugee sponsorship, the details and requirements in respect of which change from time to time. The first, government sponsorship, and that description speaks for itself. um, blended visa office referred program, usually referred to as BVOR, and that was what MET's sponsorships were under. It involves a modest government financial contribution with the sponsorship group through the sponsorship agreement holder, sometimes the United Church of Canada and sometimes the Anglican United Refugee Alliance, often known as ORA. Those sponsorship groups bear the remainder of the financial burden together with full responsibility for the settlement aspect of sponsorship. And lastly is the private sponsorship of refugees, under which the sponsorship group assumes full responsibility for both the financial and the settlement components of the sponsorship. And I understand that private sponsorship is what you're looking at, involving a refugee family related to an existing member of your community. Now, I'm certainly out of date with the technical details of sponsorship, but I hope that I can provide some useful thoughts and suggestions about planning for the arrival of a refugee family and then assisting them with all aspects of settling into life in Canada and moving towards self-sufficiency and ultimately Canadian citizenship. I think Canadian citizenship is the goal. I think many of my comments will be significant where are there members of the family already living in Toronto, because that puts quite a different complexion on the whole thing.
Can I just ask a wee question? So, because you helped maybe focus on, because we're navigating forward, mentioned the word private sponsorship. So, just to clarify, so when the United Church is the sponsorship organization of the Anglican United Church Reliant, ORA, does that mean that it would have to be someone who is then coming through that program? You know?
I simply can't tell you the answer to that. It was the situation with our two sponsored families that met.
Right, I remember that, yeah, okay.
The crucial thing, of course, to remember is that refugees coming to Canada are starting from scratch. Mm-hmm. It's a concept that is impossible for us to fully appreciate when we've even lived here in Canada for a few years, much less having been born and raised in Canada. I just cannot imagine stepping off a plane at Pearson Airport with one or two suitcases in hand and a family, and wondering how I would cope in a completely new environment. And certainly it would be very helpful in the current situation to have family members present in Canada. I would only caution that from our experience, family commitment to the sponsorship process changes as time goes on. And often the families who are already here still have enormous problems that they are dealing with. But certainly when you look at the number of refugees in the world right now, you can't help but say, there, but for the grace of God, go I. Mm-hmm. Certainly that is dramatically underscored by the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees who have, within the last month, had to leave their country on very, very short notice and under desperate circumstances. I guess making a financial contribution through one's church can help reduce our feelings of guilt. And I would be interested if there are others present to sort of hear about what motivated you. And maybe this has to be limited to a bit more of an elaboration on the particular family that we're talking about.
Well, we could possibly. So, Susan, do you want to maybe share? So, what's called you to say yes to your friend? Is it you want to?
Well,
that would be interesting.
just simply because having been born here and having, I'm only second generation. My grandparents came over, one set from England, one set from France. And, it's just sort of like what you do. This is what Canada has always been. It's been a country that people come to. And so, especially when it's a case of somebody trying to escape hardship, be it war or famine or whatever, then it's just what I feel that I should do. I think it's what we're here for, is to connect and to help each other. So that's my reason.
Now, before you leave the mic, Susan, I have a couple of questions for you. In terms of Manor Road United and other churches involved, what sort of numbers do you anticipate you'd get working actively on a refugee committee?
I have never had any experience with that, so I really couldn't tell you. I'm totally new at this, and I've been relying very, very heavily on Reverend JJ for his guidance and that. So I pray that we get a huge number, but people are low on power. It's not just from COVID, but from everything that's been happening. So some people can step up in spite of that, and some people just are willing but unable. So we'll see how that goes. The point is that, if we are doing this as a cluster of churches, then that takes the burden off. It's as though, when the more people you've got trying to lift something heavy, the less difficult it is. And that's what I'm hoping for, is that we can share this burden and work together that way.
And thank you. And does the family involved have a connection with one of the particular churches?
Well, I think we would be us, because I'm a client of them, so this is how I know about them.
Well, getting into some of the hardcore issues, money, the financial component of refugee sponsorship. Generally speaking, my observation has been that raising the required funds to provide adequately for a sponsorship seems to be the least of the sponsorship's worries, certainly in middle and upper class communities. But it is essential, in my mind, to have in hand at the outset of the sponsorship all the necessary funds with adequate reserves for the unexpected financial requirements. And they will inevitably arise. That then, of course, takes the sponsorship group, which I'm going to refer to as the team as I go on. The team has to get into some very careful and detailed budgeting and financial planning, hopefully led by someone on the team with an accounting background. The main reason for that is that there has to be a solid explanation to the refugees, who I will call the family, immediately upon their arrival, as to what is going to be done for them, and by implication, what is not going to be done for them. And with a budget laid out where they can see what the revenue side will look like, things in particular, the payments that the sponsorship group will make, but also to be factored into that are the Canada Child Benefit payments, which are very significant, certainly in the case of a large family, depending, of course, on the ages, because that is something that tapers off.
So, excuse me, Bob, many questions. So when people arrive as refugees, how soon after are they permitted to apply for those child benefits and or receive those child benefits?
And I simply no longer can tell you the answer, but it will be covered by a whole lot of little technical steps that I'm going to talk about shortly.
Good.
So we're assuming that the sponsorship group will have the necessary funds either in hand or readily available. If that's the attended to, then one significant issue can be put aside, but the bigger issues arise. And bench strength. It's the people who make the sponsorship a success. And certainly it's very important to have a mixed group on the sponsorship committee and a real depth of membership. Certainly commitment is another crucial factor. It's really considerably more than a one-year commitment. It's generally talked about in terms of being 1 year to help the family get settled in the country. But the reality is that it'll be a very rare situation where a family of refugees arrive and can get fully settled into this country in that period. And certainly we saw that at Met with particularly our first Syrian family. There is an incredible amount of work and responsibility involved. Individual leadership responsibilities must be carefully identified and backup support put in place. It's not good enough to have one person looking after the financial side of things without having a backup in case someone gets transferred out of town on a job or is ill or has family complications. And people will have health changes, and frankly, some members of the group will lose interest as time goes on. I mean, you would hope it wouldn't happen, but when some people see the level of work that's required, it's not surprising that some simply bow out. So my comment there is, have a good, strong team, many more than you think you're going to need. The next major issue, in my mind, once you've got your group in place, is the importance of planning and acting as a team. There's an incredible range of issues and concerns to be addressed as part of the on-the-ground sponsorship process. Both before the family arrive and once they're here. It's key to operate in a coordinated fashion to make sure that all aspects of the financial and settlement support are covered off. Teamwork and cooperation are essential to the success and ultimate self-sufficiency of the family. There are a myriad of areas of responsibility, and I'm going to address some of them in no particular order. And if anyone is listening in, I would certainly like to hear other suggestions at any time. We have certainly already talked about finances, but the basic things are accommodation, food, clothing, transportation. Housing is normally, in my mind, the number one on the ground issue. Hopefully, in the case of the sponsorship you're talking about, the members of the family who are already in Canada will be able to take this well in hand, and that would be an enormous step up. But I would be remiss if I didn't address briefly some of the issues relating to housing. I think the first challenge is to find affordable housing located close to the sponsorship base. And certainly for a church like Metropolitan United in downtown Toronto, that has proved to be very, very difficult. You want to be close to the family so that you can have personal contact and provide them with support and make that readily available on short notice. However, paying too much for housing during that initial year will create unreasonable expectations for the family. And if they are going to be independent at the end of the first year, they simply won't be able to meet those expectations from the resources they have available. A related task is furnishing, equipping, and decorating a dwelling unit and arranging for the technical essentials of big city life, a mobile phone, TV, internet, insurance, and a whole lot of things that don't occur to me right at the moment. Clothing, household goods, and food, and things like that are an opportunity to involve the broader membership of your church or churches in an essential part of the project. The place of residence that you arrange for the family must be turned into a home that all members of the family will feel comfortable with. And having things like toys for the youngest members of the family, if they are that young, tricycles, bicycles for the older children, and even for the parents. But I caution that in taking up a collection of such things, it's essential to be selective. Don't let the campaign simply be a dumping ground for unwanted belongings. Really, the test.
Excuse me, Bob, you immediately remind me of a challenge we have with the Shamasha family. And if you maybe would stir the memory banks back, how many, we had enough clothes for a family of 100.
I think we did, but
Yes.
Probably only 30% were up to the necessary standard. But people had the best of intentions.
They did. I remember delivering bags and bags up to somewhere in Overley Boulevard or something.
Yeah, the surplus, yeah.
Yes.
I guess really the standard in making contributions like that has to be, what would I feel comfortable with
Exactly.
if I were the recipient?
Exactly.
And different people have very different ideas about that.
And how many pairs of pants do we need?
I guess the next category is what I call assistance with the bureaucratic reality of Canada. The permanent residence card is sort of the key document when a refugee arrival comes in this country. And I think generally they are still delivered upon arrival, because you've got to be able to step right into activity. Following that, though, it's crucial to get any of the family members, all of the family members, social insurance numbers and social insurance cards. And that's a precondition to employment, but the right time to get them for the kids is at the same time as the parents. Registration for OHIP is absolutely crucial, and that has to be put in place immediately, even though refugees in the past have not qualified for OHIP coverage for a certain defined period. And I would assume that general concept is simply in place. You can't just walk into Ontario and be on the system. As I recall, when our families came, it was something like 3 months, but we were given financial support through the BVOR program in that regard. So we weren't on our own.
No.
But that is so terribly important because almost inevitably, refugees who have gone through strife and civil war and have not had proper medical care for a long time need a lot of medical and dental attention, dental in particular. As soon as they get out in the big city, public transit is an issue. A Presto card so you don't find yourself at the wrong end of a long tunnel that you can't access the subway that you're hoping to access. Opening bank accounts, an important issue, and there has to be a fair discussion with the family about how our system works. And I can recall spending certainly an hour or two with our first Syrian family, who more or less said, why do I need a bank account? And where they've come from, the only credit that was important was the cash in pocket. or what good friends would do for you. So the banking system can be a challenge even for people who've lived in this country all their lives. So you can just imagine what all is involved when you first arrived. Obtaining driver's licenses for the adults as soon as possible. And in that regard, a crucial thing is that if the adults have had driver's licenses in other jurisdictions, remind them to bring them. Don't dispose of them when they come to Canada. It can certainly facilitate and expedite the process of getting a driver's license if you can show that you had one in Syria or you had one in Turkey. And it can be, certainly these days when there's an enormous backlog to issue new driver's licenses, that can short circuit things significantly. I previously mentioned briefly the child benefit, and that is something that I believe you can get onto fairly quickly. Employment opportunities for parents. That can be more of a challenge than you might think. Certainly dependent to some degree on educational and training qualifications, but not infrequently, there are sort of emotional reasons why it's not possible to simply say to a newly arrived refugee, get out to go down the street. Someone is looking for a strong body to toss lumber out of the back of a truck. So it takes some support and encouragement to do that. A particularly important consideration in some cultures, of course, is male sensitivity about wives working. And that was certainly a major issue with both of our families, despite our assurances that wives and mothers in Canadian society regularly have fuller part-time employment. And it may just be my observation in a very few cases, it seems sometimes as if wives have a higher level of education and a more natural ability to learn English. And it's a real shame if they are forced through circumstances to stay home rather than to get out into the community and help the family get settled in. And I really do underscore that as a significant factor. Education for the parents. English language classes as appropriate and required. And related to that, of course, is the finding nursery and preschool and after school activities for children when the parents are working. And I know that in one of our family situations, once they got settled, mother and father got jobs, quite similar jobs, but on different shifts, so that one of the parents could be at home most of the time and then would be spelled off by the other, and that certainly helped. Appropriate schools for children. We sort of take that for granted. You live in a community and there's a school around the corner, but it's something that has to be looked into. I mean, things like the type of school, public or separate, Francophone or English. Our Iraqi family had lived in Lebanon for a while, and the young son, who was about 5 or 6 at the time, had more French than English. I just hope that he hasn't lost his French in the process of improving his English. I guess too, you're talking about nursery schools, junior, middle, and high school. I think sometimes, and we were lucky with our first family, the junior school and the middle school were right adjacent to each other, so that when mother was taking children to school, she had the one destination, not two, and the kids, as they grew up, simply advanced to the school next door. Summer and school break programs for the children are something that needs to be looked into well in advance of the event occurring, because such things get booked up very quickly. But there are certainly subsidies and special opportunities and free admission to events and facilities that are made available to new arrivals. And that's a matter of the sponsorship group just getting out there and making all sorts of inquiries on their own. And there are special resources that are available in government and social services. There are ethnic and national groups and community centers. And certainly, I think there's a very large and active Arabic community center in Toronto. And the other thing, we encountered a wonderful organization called Access Alliance, who were within just a few blocks of the house we arranged for our first family. And they were so supportive in all sorts of ways, not just delivery of care type services, but in helping the families to handle the system. The nitty gritty of family life. Help with finding dentists, family doctors, and required specialists, and providing transportation to and from those appointments. I found that dentists were particularly sympathetic to our refugee families. And I know for a while we took a couple of children to a very high-end dental operation on the Danforth that did not charge them a cent. And they were getting the same kind of service as the kids in the neighboring affluent neighborhood. And the city also has its own dental clinic, but it is a less reliable sort of source. But certainly our experience was, certainly with the first family, that dental care was crucial. And those are only some of the immediate issues, but there are some ongoing issues that, and ones that can be extremely sensitive, that I'd like to close off by talking about. Identifying boundaries, absolutely crucial. There is such an enormous power imbalance between refugee and sponsor. And special care must be taken to avoid misusing or abusing it. Likewise, privacy for the refugees is essential when it comes to things like medical issues. And I think more generally, sponsors are not and should not become or act like members of the refugee family. The refugees need their independence and to be able to make informed decisions on all aspects of their lives. So tied in with boundaries is expectations on both sides. I think sometimes there's a tendency on the part of individuals in the sponsorship community to want to show off new friends to their friends, to sort of boast about what they're doing. Someone to show off. On the other hand, the newly arrived family will look around and see how well everyone else in the Toronto Canadian community is looked after. I'm thinking of things in terms of clothing. I know we had an interesting discussion with one of our families after the sponsorship period was up. Mother said, well, the children needed new clothes, and because they were growing up, it's quite natural. And someone quite properly suggested going to a consignment store or a secondhand store. And the mother was horrified at the suggestion and only sort of bought into it when it was pointed out that I think all but one or two of our committee members had themselves at some time gone to such places. And I've certainly done it lots of times myself. I mean, there's no reason why you can't use an almost new sweater instead of a brand new one. And it took a while to sort of get over that hurdle.
Well, so Bob, there was a sense of phobia of secondhand clothes.
I guess maybe a phobia, I guess maybe concern about germs and the like, but I think just almost as a matter of principle, why would I subject my children to used clothing? And I don't know whether that was a result of sort of a year or 15 months in Canada and looking around at what other people seem to be doing. Yeah. Another sensitive issue is, of course, the question of transportation. I think probably in both cases, there were inquiries from our families about when we'd be buying them a car. And that was easily resolved with one family and was probably raised a dozen times by the other family. But the message got through that if you want a car, the thing to do is to get out and get a job, and if need be, get a second job.
Right.
I mean, lots of people in this country who've been here forever have taken a second job when the first one didn't meet their financial needs. So that that kind of concept, it has to be sort of clearly put out that there are lots of things you can have here, but you've got to work to and save up the resources to make it possible. Then there are just my final closing comments are, there are a few particular issues that you have to keep your eyes open for. The first, I think, and we approached it with one of our families, an individual who appeared to have ulterior motives in trying to get close to the family. And fortunately, we had a social worker on the committee for whom the warning bells went off when she saw what was going on with this relationship. And it got to the point that we alerted the police, who spoke to the individual, and it really, that resolved it there, but it had to be addressed very early on. There can be cases where members of the sponsorship group, individual members, sort of view the refugee family as a substitute family for a family they either never had or who have grown up and moved on and elsewhere. And it becomes an issue in terms of, do you invite the refugee family to your home for dinner? Do you invite them to your cottage? Certainly, some of those things can further accentuate the unreasonable and excessive expectations. And just wrestling with the issues of financial and emotional dependency. But despite my last comments and qualifications, I certainly look forward to getting involved in yet another sponsorship. And it's the kind of thing that we simply should be doing. And the United Church, which I'm part of, has taken a bit of a lead in that, but I think can do a lot more. So with that, I'm going to see if there are any questions from the audience.
Well, Bob, the question I would ask right away is, what would you do differently? Thinking of, let me rewind that a bit. I do recall when the committee rallied together and there was approval. And I do remember the wider community refugee organization, or whatever, said it was going to take 2 years. Remember that? And then it was on your mark, get set, go. I think there was 1 month's notice and you have to choose. It was like between which family you want. Do you recall that?
I certainly recall that.
Yes.
And I think the difference was that by getting into the BVOR program,
Yes.
where the government has a vested interest, and they seem to at that time have had a list of qualified
Right.
applicants, so that
Right.
It moved very quickly. I think if it had been a private sponsorship, it would have taken a lot longer for that family to have been identified and approved and transported to Canada.
So related to that, maybe I can ask, so we're thinking private, can you help a family in question move into the BDOR program?
My understanding is not.
Okay, so these are pre-approved families, okay.
Yes, and I gather that there's some sort of a United Nations Commission, High
Right.
Commission on Refugees that sort of has some mechanism for people getting onto their approved list.
Okay,
And both of our families were in that category.
okay, very good. Okay. So back to, what would you do differently?
That's a toughie, but I'm not surprised you asked me. I think a higher level of training and refresher activities for members of the committee would be a crucial thing. And the reality is we'll have a very different cross-section of people on the committee for our next refugee family. The other thing is, I think even our church may have to consider partnering with another church in the neighborhood to be sure we had the bench strength to make it happen. So, and that's something that we have been talking about, but this is not the ideal time to sort of sit down with people at a neighboring church.
No, a bit of a challenge, definitely. Now I see Betty there on the Zoom platform. Betty, did you have a question? Because you're always full of insight, wisdom.
No, I'm sorry. I had an appointment. I got home late. So I'm just, I listened to part, but I missed the beginning. I do apologize. But I know of other groups who've brought in families, and they say it really is a lifetime commitment in some ways. A group in Ottawa, and they said one of the big issues for them was the families were reluctant to have vaccines with COVID, and they were concerned about it. And so they said they felt their role was to try to teach the people sort of responsibility to community and what that meant. Was that an issue in your families?
No, it wasn't, because we were pre-COVID.
Yes, of course.
And being pre-COVID, I think the parents appreciated the medical care that was available to them and their children. And I was not aware of any situation where treatment or injections that were recommended were refused by the family.
Okay, right. Yeah, so I think these were well-established families too, having been here for about 6 years. But I guess if that can be said to well-established, but I think just different cultural beliefs and concerns.
Well, that's a very, very good point. And that sort of exhibits the fact that I'm a bit out of date on the subject, since my last involvement with our second family was just before COVID.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Now, the group in Ottawa said that they felt they had to continue their link for many years. And I'm sorry, I did miss the beginning of this, but is that what you found, or were they able to sort of find their way?
One of the families did quite well in finding their way, the second family, but they had to be pushed into doing it. I think it would be far too easy to say, look, we've got a great situation here and lots of people helping us in every way possible, but that's not the reality of living in this country, and it's not what they want to teach their children. The first family was a little different. There were some complications that I haven't elaborated upon with that family. One of our committee members, for better or worse, got very personally engaged with the family, and that was certainly a benefit to them at certain stages. I think it may have made things a little more complicated in terms of moving towards independence. And I'm a firm believer that the goal is independence, and then getting settled in this country. And there's inevitably a similar community somewhere that you can become aligned with, whether you're from South America or Turkey or
Right.
Iran.
Yes, I remember when I was living at home in Timmins, was the time of the Vietnamese boat people. And the communities did bring people up. But one of the hardest things for the Vietnamese people in Northern Ontario was the lack of foods that were sort of culturally appropriate for them, and just the foreignness of the whole culture. And there was really not a comparable group that they could link in with. Eventually, those families did leave for Southern Ontario when they'd been there for a wee while and had learned English and were able to move on in search of community. And I guess that's an important feature to find out. And as I say, I'm sorry I missed the lecture because you may have covered this, is to find that they have linkages to community as well.
No, it's a very, very good point. And frankly, I would think that Northern Ontario winters could be challenging for refugees from anywhere.
Yes.
I think that the Vietnamese refugees who arrived in Canada are a wonderful example of success of the project. And I actually have a son-in-law who arrived not as a refugee, but as a one-year-old from Vietnam.
Right.
And
yeah, I read an article about a Vietnamese family who had come and had established themselves and had their own restaurant and bakery, and they opened up to Syrian families coming in because they said, we've been through this and we can help. And I thought it was wonderful to see that family and that business saying, we can help because we know what it was like. And it was nice to see that, again, cross-cultural aspect of people who've come and recognize what needs to be done for others.
well, certainly the cross-cultural aspect is crucial in this country, and particularly in Toronto, where you're reminded of it every single day. And what a success it's been in general terms. And if you grew up in Toronto and live in Toronto, you can travel to almost any part of the world and feel right at home, because a lot of the people look quite familiar.
Yes.
No, your points are well taken and most helpful.
Oh, okay. And again, I'll have to watch the taped recording. I did want to listen to the whole thing, but I was slower walking home than I realized.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So another question, Bob, I might ask is, so when you think of the history in the 70s of welcoming, what I've been told recently, there were 70,000 Vietnamese, were both people, and much less Syrians, I think, if I stand to be corrected. And so what do you think it was? Why did we have more capacity in the 70s, or apparently, and why do we seem to have less capacity now when we seem to have more resources at our disposal? What do you have an idea of what's the difference?
Well, I suspect that a factor was government enthusiasm for it. And I'm just not sure what the numbers are.
So one, I'm not to name any names, but we say Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the leader, I think, at the time, if I'm not mistaken, and the later Trudeau. Okay.
Yes, I think that there was general government support
Right. Okay.
for it.
Okay. Oh, good. Okay.
Mhm. I'm wondering too, if the fact that we've been through and aware of terrorism, if that impacts the ability to get into the country because we're screening more, or we're being more careful, and that may be an issue too. I'm wondering if that impacts people, although we're seeing now that with the Ukrainian situation, they're going to try to open up and process people through faster.
Well, it's certainly far more challenging times now internationally than in the Vietnam.
Yes. Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I think that just adds different dimensions and layers of challenges.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one maybe final question was, you mentioned that private sponsorship takes much longer, and so we better hurry up and get going, so to speak.
That's certainly my understanding,
Yes.
but in any event, I think we all have to hurry up and get going on the refugee front, whether it's
Yes.
BVOR or private sponsorship.
However we go.
And I simply don't know what, if anything, the government is doing in terms of government sponsorship.
Right.
Government seems to have its hands full on
A lot of other,
Enough.
yes.
a lot of other fronts.
Well, as we perhaps bring our time to a close, do you have any maybe closing thoughts and maybe words of wisdom as we go out?
I guess my really final closing thought is jump into it with enthusiasm. I think we all have to do that. We can't fret about it too much. We simply have to get down to work. And certainly I'm going to be advocating that at Vernon United, and
Okay.
We'll see where it unfolds.
Okay, well, and then thank you, Bob, and we'll back over to Susan.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I enjoyed it, and I hope you can join us next week when we will have Chef Mia back for spring cookies. So I hope you can join us then.